Diane, open. I still remain your mother.
My name is Diane Whitfield, and I want to tell you something that happened in my own home, in my own kitchen, on a Tuesday evening that started out like any other. 3 words. That is all it took to change everything between me and the 2 people I had spent my entire adult life trying to take care of. My stepfather looked me dead in the eye, standing in the kitchen of the house I had paid for with my own money, my own sweat, my own sacrifice, and he said, "You are not real family." He said it so plainly, so easily, like he was commenting on the weather, like the words did not weigh anything at all. He had no idea what those 3 words were about to set in motion. He had no idea that by the end of that week, he and my mother would be standing on my porch in the cold, knocking on a door that no longer opened for them. I want you to picture it with me for a moment. A porch light flickering against the dark, 2 fists pounding against a heavy wooden door, my mother's voice, cracking, calling my name over and over, my stepfather's voice underneath hers, low and furious, demanding to be let back into a house he had convinced himself belonged to him just as much as it belonged to me, and on the other side of that door, me, standing perfectly still, my hand resting on a deadbolt that I had changed myself only hours before. I was not crying. I was not shaking. I had done all of my crying already, days and weeks and months before that night, quietly, alone, in a bathroom with the faucet running so no one would hear me. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What I am about to tell you is not a story about a house, even though a house sits at the center of it. It is not really a story about money either, even though money certainly played its part. This is a story about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally start keeping score, start drawing lines around who counts and who does not, start deciding, quietly and then not so quietly, that the person who gave the most somehow deserves the least. It is a story about the slow, almost invisible way a family can turn on its own provider, the one who paid the bills and fixed the roof and never once complained, until one day she stops being seen as family at all and starts being seen as staff. I was 34 years old the night I locked that door, and I had spent nearly a decade building the life that made it possible for me to own that house in the first place. I will tell you everything, from the very beginning, because I think you deserve to understand exactly how a daughter who would have done anything for her mother ended up standing on the other side of a locked door, listening to her own family beg to be let back in. I think you deserve to know what it felt like in that moment, and more than that, I think you deserve to know what led me there, step by step, year by year, lie by lie, until there was nothing left for me to do but turn that key. There are 3 questions I want you to hold on to as I tell you this story, because these 3 questions kept me up at night for longer than I care to admit. The first question is this: why would a woman who owns her own home, free and clear, allow the very people who disrespected her to live under her roof in the first place? Why would she pay the mortgage, cover the utilities, stock the refrigerator, and still walk on eggshells every single morning just to keep the peace? I will tell you why. Because she loved her mother more than she loved herself, and for a very long time, she confused sacrifice with loyalty. She confused keeping quiet with being a good daughter. She confused letting things slide with being the bigger person. And by the time she realized those things were not the same at all, the damage had already been done, and the disrespect had already settled in, like furniture nobody planned to move. The second question I want you to sit with is this: how does a man who married into a family, who did not raise the woman whose house he is living in, who contributed nothing to the down payment, nothing to the renovation costs, nothing to the property taxes, somehow arrive at the conclusion that he has the right to tell her who is and who is not real family? How does that happen? How does a person go from being a guest in someone else's life to appointing himself the authority on what that life is worth? I can tell you that it does not happen overnight. It does not arrive suddenly, like a storm you can see coming from across the field. It creeps in, slowly, the way rust creeps into iron, the way cracks spread through a foundation that looks perfectly solid from the outside, until one day you press your hand against the wall, and the whole thing gives way. And the third question, the one that I think is going to stay with you long after this video ends, is simply this: was I wrong? When I turned that key and stood on my side of that door and let the silence answer for me, was I wrong for doing it? Was I wrong for finally choosing myself after years of choosing everyone else? I have asked myself that question more times than I can count, lying awake in the same house that had suddenly become so much quieter, so much more mine than it had ever felt before. Some people in my life said yes, I went too far. Some people said I did not go far enough. And some people, the ones who had lived something similar, who had sat in a quiet room somewhere and finally understood what it means to stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening in the first place, those people said nothing at all. They just nodded, because they already knew the answer long before I did. I am going to take you back to the beginning now, and I mean the very beginning, because you cannot understand what happened on that Tuesday evening without understanding the years that led up to it. You cannot understand the woman standing on the other side of that locked door without understanding the girl who grew up believing that if she just worked hard enough, gave enough, loved enough, kept enough of her hurt hidden, the family she had always wanted would eventually feel real. This is that story, and I promise you, by the time I am finished telling it, you will not need me to answer those 3 questions for you. You will already know. I grew up in a small town in central Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your business before you know it yourself, where the same families have lived on the same streets for 3 and 4 generations, where the grocery store cashier went to school with your mother and your mother's mother before her. It was the kind of town that felt safe when you were inside it, and suffocating the moment you started to grow beyond it. I was born the only child of Margaret and Robert Whitfield, and for the first 8 years of my life, we were what I would have called a normal family, whatever that means. We had a small house on Clover Street, with a green front door and a backyard big enough for a swing set. My father worked at the paper mill, my mother waitressed at a diner called Patsy's on Route 9, and she was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's name and their coffee order and whether they took sugar or not. My parents' marriage ended the summer I turned 9, and I remember that summer with a kind of sharp, specific clarity that I think only children of divorce ever really understand. I remember the sound of voices behind closed doors. I remember my mother crying at the kitchen sink with the faucet running, the same way I would cry years later in my own bathroom, for entirely different but somehow connected reasons. I remember the morning my father's truck was no longer in the driveway, and my mother sat across from me at the breakfast table and said, very quietly, that some things just do not work out the way you plan them, and that it had nothing to do with me. I believed her on the second part. I am still not entirely sure about the first. My father moved to Columbus and eventually remarried a woman named Sandra, and while he and I maintained a relationship, it was the kind that lived mostly in birthday cards and occasional phone calls, thin and polite, and never quite enough. My mother, on the other hand, threw herself into being everything at once. She worked double shifts at Patsy's. She kept our house spotless. She showed up to every single school event, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game I ever played, even the ones where I sat on the bench the whole time. She was remarkable in the way that single mothers often are, quietly remarkable, the kind of remarkable that does not get celebrated because it looks too much like what people expect women to do anyway. I watched her, and I learned from her, and what I learned was that you work. You do not complain. You carry what needs to be carried, and you keep moving, and eventually, things get better. That lesson shaped everything about who I became. It also made it very hard for me, later in life, to recognize when I was carrying something I never should have picked up in the first place. My mother met Gary Collins when I was 12 years old. He came into Patsy's one morning for breakfast and sat in her section, and she told me later that he had tipped her $20 on a $6 meal and that she had thought he was either generous or showing off, and she was not sure which. He turned out to be a little of both, as most charming men tend to be. Gary was 41 at the time, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of easy smile that makes a room feel warmer when he walks into it. He had grown up in Kentucky, worked in construction project management, and had been briefly married once before to a woman he never spoke about in any specific detail, which I would later come to understand as a pattern rather than a coincidence. He was funny in that effortless, storytelling kind of way, and he called my mother Maggie from the very first week, which nobody else had ever called her, and which she seemed to love in a way that was almost painful to watch because she deserved to be loved like that. She deserved all of it. I just wish it had been by someone more worthy of the name. Gary and my mother dated for 2 years before they married, and in those 2 years, he was careful. I want you to understand that word, careful, because it is doing a lot of work in this story. He was careful about how he treated me. He was present without being overbearing. He came to some of my school events, but never all of them, which at the time seemed respectful and later seemed strategic. He asked me questions about my life and remembered the answers the next time. He fixed things around the house without being asked and never made a production of it. He made my mother laugh in a way I had not heard her laugh in years, and as a 12-year-old girl who had watched her mother be tired and alone for 3 years, I was not immune to that. I wanted to like him. I tried to like him, and for a while I genuinely did. They married in June, on a Saturday, in a small ceremony at the county courthouse, followed by a dinner at a restaurant in town that Gary paid for, and that everyone said was very generous. I was a bridesmaid at 13, in a pale yellow dress that my mother had picked out, and that I wore without complaint because it was her day, and she was happy, and that was enough for me. I remember looking at Gary during the ceremony, watching the way he held my mother's hand, and thinking, with the sincere and slightly desperate hope that only a child of divorce can manufacture, that maybe this time it would be different, maybe this time it would hold. The first years of their marriage were not bad, not exactly. Gary moved in with us on Clover Street and made himself at home in the specific way that men sometimes do, which is to say, gradually, piece by piece, until one day you look up and realize the house looks more like his than yours, without any single moment you could point to where the shift happened. He put his tools in the garage. He moved things in the kitchen to where he thought they made more sense. He changed the television programming and started calling the living room the den, and referring to family decisions as something we all needed to discuss together, which sounded democratic, but in practice meant that his opinion settled things. My mother deferred to him in a way that I think she believed was partnership, but that felt to me, even as a teenager, more like disappearance. The woman who had run that household alone and fiercely for 3 years started to fade a little at the edges, and Gary's outline got sharper in her place. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you that Gary was a monster in those early years. He was not. He provided. He was not cruel to me, not openly. He was something subtler, and in some ways harder to name. He was dismissive in small, deniable ways. He forgot things that mattered to me. He had a habit of changing the subject when I spoke about my achievements. Not rudely, just smoothly, the way a river redirects itself around a stone. So naturally, you almost do not notice it happening. He praised my mother extravagantly and acknowledged me minimally, and over time that gap, the space between how much I was seen and how much I was overlooked, quietly became the architecture of our household. I told myself it was fine. I told myself that plenty of step-parents and step-children had awkward dynamics, and that it did not mean anything was wrong. I was a teenager, and then I was 18, and then I was leaving for college, and I packed my bags and I left, and I remember thinking, with a relief I still feel guilty about, that I was finally free. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship and worked 2 jobs to cover the rest. I studied business administration and graduated in 3.5 years because I took summer classes and I did not have the luxury of taking my time. I had a plan. I had always had a plan because the girl who grew up watching her mother work double shifts to keep the lights on does not arrive at adulthood without a very detailed plan. I wanted to own something. I wanted something that was mine, in the way that Clover Street had never quite been mine after Gary arrived. Something with my name on the deed and no asterisk beside it. I wanted a home that could not be rearranged without my permission. I moved to Columbus after graduation, took a job at a mid-size logistics company, and spent the next several years building a life with the same quiet intensity my mother had modeled for me. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment and lived beneath my means. I put money aside every single month without exception. I did not take vacations. I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it until it finally gave up on a Tuesday morning on Route 70. I was 28 years old when I sat across from a mortgage lender and signed my name to a house on Birchwood Drive, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a front porch and a backyard and a green front door, because I had always loved the green door on Clover Street, even after everything that happened inside it. That house was the proudest moment of my life, and I want you to hold on to that feeling, because everything that comes after it is a story about what happens when you let the wrong people through the door of the thing you worked hardest to build. 10 o'clock to 20 o'clock. The turning point. Parents move in. I had been in my house on Birchwood Drive for just under 2 years when my mother called me on a Wednesday afternoon in February and told me that she and Gary were in trouble. Not trouble in the vague, everything is fine but not really way she sometimes called to describe. Real trouble. The kind that comes with overdue notices and a landlord who has already started the paperwork. Gary had been working as a project manager for a mid-size construction company in Dayton, and the company had lost a major contract and restructured, which is a clean word for what actually happened, which is that 15 people were let go on a Friday afternoon with 2 weeks of severance and no explanation beyond what fit in a single-paragraph email. Gary was one of those 15 people. He was 57 years old, and he had been with that company for 9 years, and just like that, the income that had been carrying their household was gone. My mother's waitressing income alone, which had never been much, was nowhere near enough to cover their rent, their car payments, their utilities, and the various other expenses that had quietly accumulated over the years. They had been living on 2 incomes without ever really building a cushion beneath them. I found this out in pieces, the way you always find out the full truth with family. Not all at once in one honest conversation, but slowly, detail by detail, as each new revelation makes the last one make more sense. First it was the rent that was behind. Then I found out the car insurance had lapsed. Then I learned there was a credit card balance that had been growing for the better part of a year. My mother had not told me any of this while it was happening, because she did not want me to worry, which is the thing mothers say when they actually mean they did not want to feel like they needed saving. I did not hesitate. I want to make sure you understand that. I did not sit down and make a pros and cons list. I did not call a friend to think it through. The moment my mother finished talking, I told her she and Gary could come stay with me on Birchwood Drive for as long as they needed while they got back on their feet. I had 3 bedrooms. I was living alone. The guest room had been sitting empty since I bought the place, and the thought of my mother in financial crisis while I had unused space in my house was something I could not live with. I told her they could move in at the end of the month. I told her not to worry about contributing to the bills right away, that we would figure all of that out once Gary found work. I told her I loved her, and I meant every word of every bit of it, which is the part of this story that I think matters most, because what came after was not the result of me making a careless decision. It was the result of me making a loving one that the wrong people took advantage of. They arrived on a Saturday with 2 cars packed full and a rented trailer behind Gary's truck. I had cleaned the guest room and put fresh towels out and bought groceries for the week. I had made my mother's favorite dinner, a pot roast with carrots and potatoes that she had made for me every birthday of my childhood, because I wanted her to walk into my house and feel cared for, feel welcomed, feel like the fact that things had fallen apart did not mean she had failed. She cried when she walked through the door, and I held her in my front hallway for a long time, and Gary stood behind her with his hands in his pockets and looked around at my living room with an expression I did not know how to read at the time, but that I have since had plenty of time to think about. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more like assessment, like a man calculating square footage. The first month was fine. Fine is the word I keep coming back to, because it was not wonderful, and it was not terrible. It was fine in the way that most things are fine, when everyone is still on their best behavior, and the novelty of a new arrangement has not yet worn off. My mother cooked dinner most nights, which I genuinely appreciated. Gary fixed a leak under the kitchen sink that I had been meaning to call a plumber about for months. We watched television together in the evenings and talked about ordinary things. I told myself this was working. I told myself I had made the right call. And then, somewhere around the 6-week mark, things began to shift in ways that were so small and so gradual that I almost talked myself out of noticing them. It started with the television. I know that sounds like a petty place to start, but bear with me, because the television was never really about the television. Gary began changing the channel when I was watching something, not aggressively, just casually, the way a man does when he has decided that his comfort in a space takes precedence over someone else's. When I mentioned it, mildly, without accusation, he laughed and said he had not realized I was watching, which was not true because I was sitting directly in front of it with the remote on my lap. My mother looked at her hands. I let it go. Then it was the kitchen. Gary started rearranging things, moving my pots to different cabinets, reorganizing my pantry into a system that made sense to him and that I had to relearn in my own house every time I wanted to cook something. When I gently asked him to leave things where I had them, he told me, with the patient tone of a man who has decided he is being very reasonable, that the new arrangement was more efficient. I let that go too. I let a lot of things go in those early weeks because I had told myself a story about who I was in this situation. I was the generous one. I was the daughter who had opened her home. I was the bigger person. And the trouble with deciding to be the bigger person is that you can end up spending so long looking down from that height that you do not notice how much ground you have given up beneath your feet. By the third month, Gary was receiving mail at my address and referring to it as the house in conversations with other people, not Diane's house, not where we are staying, just the house, as though it were a neutral entity that belonged equally to everyone living inside it. I heard him say it on the phone one afternoon when he did not know I was in the hallway, and I stood very still for a moment, and something inside me went quiet and alert in a way it had not been before. By the fourth month, Gary had started having opinions about things that had nothing to do with him. He had opinions about my work schedule. He thought I was putting in too many hours at the office and not spending enough time at home, which was a remarkable thing for a man who was unemployed and living rent-free in my house to have an opinion about. He had opinions about the friends I had, over whether they were the right kind of people, whether they stayed too late, whether the noise was appropriate for a weeknight. He had opinions about the neighborhood and which neighbors I should be friendlier with and which ones I should keep at a distance, as though he had lived on Birchwood Drive his whole life and I were the newcomer. And through all of it, my mother said very little. She would catch my eye sometimes, across the dinner table or in the kitchen, and I could see in her face that she knew, that she was aware of what was happening, but she had made a choice about which relationship she was going to protect, and it was not mine. I want to pause here for a moment and tell you about my half-brother, Marcus, because you need to know about Marcus to understand the full picture. Marcus was Gary's son from his first marriage, the marriage he never talked about in detail. He was 26 at the time all of this was happening, 3 years younger than me, and he lived in Cincinnati with a girlfriend and a job in sales that he described as going great whenever anyone asked, which usually meant it was not going great at all. Marcus and I had never been close, not hostile, just distant, in the way that step-siblings sometimes are when they come together as teenagers and never quite bridge the gap. But Gary adored Marcus in a way that was visible and unguarded, and that stood in sharp contrast to the way he treated me, which was present but contained, warm enough to be deniable as cold, but never, not once, the way you look at someone you are genuinely proud of. Gary talked about Marcus constantly. Marcus had a great head for business. Marcus was going to turn things around soon. You would see. Marcus reminded him of himself at that age, which Gary seemed to think was a compliment worth repeating. Whenever Marcus called, Gary's whole face changed, and I do not begrudge a father loving his son. I want to be clear about that. But I noticed the contrast. I noticed the way Gary would walk past me cooking dinner in my own kitchen to take Marcus's call in the other room, laughing loudly, and then return to the table and say nothing to me at all for the rest of the evening. I noticed that when Marcus visited for a weekend that spring and slept on the pull-out sofa in the living room, Gary referred to the whole weekend as having the family together, as though I lived there too, but also was not entirely part of what he meant by family. I filed all of it away, the way you file things away when you are not yet ready to look at them directly. 20 o'clock to 35. The conflict escalates. 6 months in, Gary found a part-time consulting position through a former colleague, and I thought, with genuine relief, that this would mark the turning point, that having income again would restore his sense of himself and ease some of the tension I had been quietly absorbing. Instead, What happened was that the little bit of financial footing seemed to give him confidence he had not had before. The way a man who has been borrowing someone else's umbrella in the rain sometimes starts to act as though he brought it himself once the sun comes out. He started talking about the house as a long-term situation rather than a temporary one. He mentioned, casually, over dinner one evening, that they were thinking of staying through the end of the year, at least. Not asking. Telling. My mother looked at her plate. I said that sounded fine, and changed the subject, and spent the rest of the evening in my bedroom with a feeling I could not yet name sitting heavily in my chest. It was around this time that I learned, through a conversation that was not meant for me, that Gary had been telling people in town, friends of theirs from back in Dayton who had since called my mother to catch up, that he and Maggie were settled now, that they were living in a nice house in Columbus that Diane had bought, as though I were a feature of the property rather than the person who owned it. He told one of my mother's friends that the arrangement was working out well for everyone, which I suppose was true if by everyone he meant himself. What he did not tell anyone, as far as I could determine, was that he was not contributing to the mortgage. He was not contributing to the utilities. He had given my mother a small amount toward groceries a few times, and she had passed it to me as though it were an offering, and I had accepted it without saying anything, because saying something would have required me to admit to myself that I had expected more. I want to tell you about the evening I found out about the will, because I think that is when the story shifted from a story about tension to a story about something much more deliberate. My mother's older sister, my Aunt Carol, passed away in October of that year after a long illness. It was a grief we had been preparing for, but that still arrived like a physical blow when it finally came. My mother flew to Cincinnati for the arrangements, and I drove down on the weekend to be with her for the service. It was a hard few days, the kind that strip everything down to what actually matters, and I thought, sitting in that church next to my mother, that whatever small grievances had been accumulating between us were things we could work through, because she was my mother, and I loved her, and that was bigger than any of it. I found out about the will 3 weeks after the funeral, when my Aunt Carol's attorney contacted my mother with the details of the estate. My aunt had not been wealthy, but she had owned her home outright, a small 2-bedroom house in Cincinnati that was paid off and that she had kept immaculate her entire life, and she had also left behind a collection of jewelry and some savings, enough to matter. In her will, she had divided things between my mother and her 2 other siblings, and she had included a separate note for me, her only niece, that was read aloud by the attorney over the phone while I sat at my kitchen table. In it, she said she was proud of the woman I had become, and that she wanted me to have her mother's ring, my grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a small emerald that I had loved since childhood, and that my aunt had always said would come to me one day. The ring never came to me. I found out why when I overheard a conversation between my mother and Gary one evening in the kitchen, standing in the hallway with a laundry basket in my hands, and my heart slowly turning to stone. Gary was saying that the ring ought to go to Marcus's girlfriend, who he and my mother had met twice, because they were likely heading toward an engagement, and it would mean more on someone's hand than sitting in a box somewhere. My mother said my name, once, quietly, as though posing a question. Gary said that I was doing fine, that I had my house and my career and my whole life ahead of me, and that Marcus was at a stage where a gesture like that could make a real difference. He said it the way you say something you have already decided, and my mother said nothing further, and the ring went to a woman I had met on 2 occasions, and my grandmother's emerald disappeared out of my life, as quietly and completely as if it had never existed at all. I did not confront them that night. I went into the laundry room, and I put the clothes in the machine, and I stood there with my forehead against the cool of the dryer, for a long time, breathing slowly, and I made a decision that I was going to start paying closer attention. I was going to stop filing things away and start actually looking at what I had been collecting. All of those small moments, the rearranged kitchen, the television, the mail with his name on it, the word family that seemed to expand to include everyone except me. I was going to look at the full picture, and I was going to be honest about what I saw. And what I saw, when I finally let myself see it, was that Gary Collins had been quietly, methodically making himself at home in a life he had not built and had no right to, and that my mother had been letting him, and that I had been the last one in the house to understand any of it. There was a week in November that I think of as the week things finally became impossible to ignore. It began on a Monday when Gary called a repairman to fix a crack in the ceiling of the master bedroom, which was my bedroom, without telling me. I came home from work to find a strange man on a ladder in my room, and Gary standing below him explaining what needed to be done. And when I asked Gary why he had not mentioned it, he told me the crack had been there for weeks and that somebody needed to handle it. I said that I was the homeowner and that decisions about the house needed to go through me. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that I had seen flicker across his face before, but that had always been gone before I could name it. And then it was gone again, and he said sure, of course, and turned back to the repairman. On Wednesday of that same week, I received a call from my neighbor Linda, a warm woman in her 60s who gardened obsessively and who had brought me a welcome basket when I first moved in. She called to tell me, gently and with obvious discomfort, that she had run into Gary at the mailboxes that morning and that he had introduced himself as the owner of the house, not as a guest or a relative, but as the owner, and that she had not known what to say, so she had said nothing, but she wanted me to know because she felt it was not right. I thanked her. I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes after I hung up, and then I went inside and I made dinner, and I set the table, and I did not say anything, because I was still trying to understand why I felt so afraid of saying something in my own house, and that question frightened me more than anything Gary had done. On Friday, Gary's son Marcus called while we were all at dinner, and Gary excused himself to take the call, as he always did, and came back 20 minutes later, saying that Marcus might be coming for Christmas and that they should probably talk about the guest room situation because Marcus would need somewhere to sleep. The guest room, at that point, was being used by my mother as a reading room and a place to keep her sewing materials. Gary was proposing to rearrange my house to accommodate a guest I had not been consulted about, and he announced it not as a question but as a planning matter, something to be worked out logistically rather than something to be discussed with the woman whose name was on the mortgage. I put my fork down. My mother looked at me, and I said, very calmly, that we should probably talk about a few things, and Gary said sure, any time, in the same tone he always used when he meant he had no intention of taking me seriously. And I went to bed that night, knowing that the conversation we needed to have was coming, and that nothing about it was going to be easy. 35 o'clock, the line, "You're not real family." The conversation did not happen the way I had planned it. I had spent a weekend mentally rehearsing what I was going to say, the points I was going to make, the calm and measured way I was going to lay out my concerns, without raising my voice or letting myself cry, or giving Gary any reason to dismiss what I was saying as emotional or dramatic. I had rehearsed the conversation so many times that I had begun to feel almost prepared for it, and then the actual evening arrived, and it went nothing like my rehearsal, because real confrontations never do. They come faster than you expect, and from directions you were not watching. It started as a dinner conversation on a Tuesday evening in late November. The three of us were at the kitchen table, eating spaghetti that my mother had made, and Gary was talking about Christmas again, about Marcus coming, about what the plans should be, and something about the way he kept talking, kept making plans, in a house that was not his for a holiday he had not been invited to host, finally cracked something open in me that I had been pressing shut for months. I put down my fork and I said, "Gary, I need to talk to you about something." And he looked at me, and I could see that he knew something was different about the way I was saying it, and he leaned back in his chair, and he crossed his arms, and he said, "Okay." I told him that I needed us to have an honest conversation about the arrangement we had fallen into, because I felt like it had drifted far from what we had all agreed to at the beginning. I told him that when I had offered for him and my mother to stay, it was meant to be temporary, and that we were now going on 8 months with no clear plan or timeline. I told him that there were some patterns I had noticed that I needed to address, the way he spoke about the house to other people, the decisions he made about repairs and visitors without consulting me, the way he had positioned himself as the head of a household that was mine. I kept my voice steady. I had my hands flat on the table. I said every word I had rehearsed, as clearly and as respectfully as I knew how. Gary listened. He let me finish, and then he said, in a very quiet voice, that he appreciated me laying it out like that, but that I needed to understand something too. He said that family does not operate like a business transaction. He said that he had given 9 years of his life to a company that had thrown him away, and that he was working his way back, and that it would help if the people around him were a little more patient and a little less focused on technicalities like whose name was on a piece of paper. He said that he and my mother were not tenants. They were family, and that a home shared by family is not the same as a property managed by a landlord. He said it like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow on the uptake, and I felt the heat of it rise up through my chest and into my face, but I kept my hands flat on the table. I said, very carefully, that I agreed family was different from a business arrangement, and that was exactly why I was confused about some of the decisions he had been making without me, decisions about my home, my property, my personal belongings, because in my understanding, the fact that we were family was supposed to mean that he would respect me, not override me. I said the word respect slowly and deliberately, and I watched his face change. The quiet voice went away, and something harder came in behind it. He said he had done nothing but try to help around this house since they arrived. He said that I had the kind of mentality that came from being on your own too long. He said that I had never really understood what family meant because I had grown up in a broken home and had spent so many years focused on myself that I had never learned how a family actually functions. My mother said his name, just his name, one syllable, the way you say someone's name when you want them to stop but you are not willing to make them. He did not stop. He said, and I am going to tell you his exact words, because they are the ones that changed everything. He looked at me across the table of the house I had saved for, and bought and maintained for 4 years, and he said, you need to understand, Diane, that Margaret and I are the real family here. You're not real family. You never have been. You're her daughter, and I've always treated you decently, but let's not pretend this is something it isn't. The table went completely silent. My mother's hand was over her mouth. I do not know what my face was doing. I felt something very strange, a kind of absolute stillness that I had never experienced before, like every feeling I had been carefully managing for 8 months had suddenly frozen solid. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I pushed my chair back from the table and I stood up, and I said, very quietly, that I thought everyone needed some air, and I walked to my bedroom, and I closed the door, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a very long time. I heard them talking through the wall. I heard my mother's voice, low and urgent. I heard Gary's voice, less heated now, quieter, the way a person's voice gets when they know they have gone too far and are trying to reassess rather than actually reckon with it. I heard the front door open and their footsteps go out onto the porch, and then there was nothing but the house settling around me in the way old houses do, with small sounds that usually felt familiar, and that night felt like the house was deciding something too. I sat in the dark for maybe an hour, and then I picked up my phone, and I found the number of a locksmith I had seen advertised on a flyer tucked into my mailbox 3 weeks before and had held on to without knowing why, and I called and left a message asking if they had availability first thing in the morning, and then I went to bed, and I slept better than I had slept in months. 45 o'clock to 55. The lockout and fallout. The locksmith arrived at 7:15 in the morning, a Thursday, while my mother and Gary were still asleep. His name was a name on a patch on his shirt, and he was businesslike and efficient, and he did not ask me any questions about why I was changing the locks on my own home, because it was my home, and it was none of his business, and I loved him for that. He changed the front door, the back door, and the door from the garage into the kitchen. He handed me 3 sets of the new keys, and I paid him in cash, and I thanked him, and he left. And I stood in my kitchen with 3 sets of keys in my hand, and I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time, which was that I was in charge of what happened inside these walls. I left a note on the kitchen counter. I want to be honest about this because I have heard it told both ways, that I locked them out without warning, and that I gave them plenty of notice, and the truth is somewhere in between. The note said that I had changed the locks, and that I was asking them to make arrangements to stay somewhere else, while we all had time to think about what had been said and what the next steps would be. I said I was not making a permanent decision in that moment, just creating some space. I said I hoped my mother understood, and that I loved her, and that I would be in touch. I left the note on top of Gary's coffee mug because I wanted to make sure he saw it, and then I got dressed and I went to work. I was in a meeting that afternoon when my phone began vibrating against the conference table. I silenced it without looking at it, because I already knew. I finished the meeting, and I walked to an empty office, and I sat down, and I looked at my phone. 11 missed calls, 4 from my mother, 3 from Gary, 2 from Marcus, whose number I almost did not recognize because he had rarely called me directly about anything. 1 from a number I did not know that turned out, when I listened to the voicemail, to be Gary's older sister in Kentucky, who had apparently been recruited to call me and tell me I was being hysterical. And 1 from my Aunt Ruth, on my father's side, who had somehow already heard, which meant my mother had been on the phone before they even got back to the house and found themselves locked out. I called my mother back first. She was upset in the way I had known she would be, hurt and confused and defending Gary in a way that I think she believed was loyalty and that I experienced as the same silence she had offered me at the dinner table the night before, just louder. She said I had humiliated them. She said I had no right to put them out of the house they were living in, without more warning, without more time, without a conversation first. And I reminded her gently that I had tried to have a conversation the night before, and that her husband had told me I was not real family in my own kitchen. And she went quiet for a moment, and then she said that Gary had been under a lot of stress and had not meant it the way it sounded. I asked her what way he had meant it. She did not have an answer. Gary called back an hour after I spoke to my mother. He was controlled in a way that told me he had rehearsed the call, had decided what posture to take. He did not apologize. He said that what he had said at dinner had come out wrong, but that his overall point stood, that I had been treating them like inconveniences rather than family, and that changing the locks was an extreme reaction that said more about me than it did about him. He said he expected to be back in the house by the weekend, and that he hoped I would be willing to sit down and talk by then like adults. I said I would be in touch, and I ended the call, and I blocked his number, and it was the most peaceful I had felt in 8 months. Marcus left a voicemail that surprised me more than any of it. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He said, in a voice that sounded genuinely tired, that he knew his dad could be a lot, and that he was sorry things had gotten to this point, and that he hoped I would reconsider. It was the most human thing anyone in that family had said to me in a year, and it landed strangely because it came from the person whose name had been used as a weapon against me more times than he probably knew. I did not call him back that day, but I thought about that voicemail for a long time afterward. My mother and Gary stayed with a friend of hers for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, the quiet of my house was so complete and so unfamiliar that I spent the first several days not quite trusting it, walking from room to room as though I were checking to make sure it was real. My kitchen was exactly as I had arranged it. My living room remote was on the cushion where I had left it. Nobody changed the channel. Nobody rearranged anything. Nobody made decisions about my home. I cooked dinner for myself and ate it at my own table and watched whatever I wanted and went to bed when I chose. And slowly, over those 2 weeks, the house on Birchwood Drive became mine again, in a way it had not been since the day they arrived. 55 locks at 110. Aftermath. My mother came to see me alone on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the lockout. She called ahead, which she had never done before, which told me that she understood something had changed. I made coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table, and we looked at each other for a moment without speaking, and I saw in her face all the years of her, all the tiredness and the love and the long, complicated history of the two of us, and I wanted so much for the conversation to go differently than I suspected it was going to go. She started by saying that she missed me. I told her I missed her too. She said she hoped we could find a way through this, and I said I did too, and I meant it. And then she said that Gary was willing to apologize, that he had come to understand he had said something he should not have, but that there were things on both sides that needed to be looked at, and I felt the conversation tipping into the familiar territory of balance, of both sides, of everyone having contributed to the problem equally, and I stopped her gently and I said, "Mom, I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to actually hear it." She said okay. I said that I did not need Gary's conditional apology. What I needed was for her to tell me honestly whether she believed what he had said about me, whether she agreed with him that I was not real family, whether she had sat at that table and let those words go unanswered because she did not know how to respond, or because somewhere inside her she had not entirely disagreed. The silence that followed that question was the longest silence of my adult life. My mother looked down at her coffee cup, and she did not speak for what felt like a full minute. And then she said, very quietly, that she had always worried about me, that I had always been so independent, so capable, so self-contained, that sometimes she genuinely did not know how to be my mother, how to give me what I needed when I never seemed to need anything. She said that Gary had filled a space in her life that had been empty for a long time, and that she loved him, and that she knew he had flaws, but that she needed me to understand that loving him did not mean she loved me less. I told her that I believed that. I told her I had never doubted her love for me. I told her the question had not been about love. The question had been about respect, and about whose side she was on when it mattered, and that on the one night it had mattered more than any other night. She had looked at her plate. She cried then, quietly, the way she had cried at the kitchen sink on Clover Street 30 years ago, and I reached across the table and I held her hand, and I let her cry, and I did not take it back. We talked for another 2 hours. We talked about Gary, and about my father, and about all the years in between, about the ways I had needed her, and the ways she had needed me, and the ways we had both failed to say so. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was also, somehow, the most painful one, because honesty between people who love each other carries a weight that cruelty never does. Cruelty is clean. Honesty is complicated. Gary did not come back to Birchwood Drive. That was the line I held, and my mother understood eventually, even if she did not immediately agree with it. He and my mother found an apartment in a modest complex across town, and my mother contributed more than half the rent from her waitressing income and a small sum she received from Aunt Carol's estate, and I helped them with the security deposit without being asked, because she was my mother, and I was not trying to punish her, I was trying to protect myself, and those two things are not the same, even though people sometimes treat them as though they are. Gary found more consistent work through the spring of the following year, and my mother and I fell into a new rhythm. Sunday phone calls, dinners every few weeks at a restaurant that was neither her space nor mine, a careful and tender middle ground where we were both learning what our relationship looked like now that it no longer had the architecture of the same roof holding it together. I heard through my mother, months later, that Gary had told people in their social circle that I had thrown them out over a disagreement, that I had overreacted, that he had only ever tried to help me, and I had repaid him poorly. I heard this, and I felt something I had not expected, which was almost nothing. Not because I did not care what people thought of me, but because I had spent so long managing the story, managing the peace, managing the image of our family from the inside, that the idea of it being managed about me from the outside felt oddly like relief. Let him tell it. I knew what happened in that kitchen. My mother knew. The house on Birchwood Drive knew, and it had been keeping the truth in its walls since the day I changed the locks. Emotional resolution. I spent the first spring after everything happened doing something I had not done in years, which was living in my house like it belonged to me. I know that sounds like a strange thing to have to relearn, but if you have ever shared a space with someone who quietly expanded to fill it, you will understand what I mean. I painted the kitchen the color I had originally wanted when I moved in, and then talked myself out of, because I had not wanted to deal with Gary's opinion about it. I rearranged the living room furniture the way I had always imagined it. I planted things in the backyard, tomatoes and lavender and a rose bush along the fence, and I watered them every morning before work, and there was something about having living things to tend to that was very deeply what I needed at that point in my life. I started therapy that spring as well, which I mention not as a footnote but as something central to this story, because I do not think I would have made sense of any of it without a space to say all of it out loud to someone trained to listen. My therapist, a woman in her 50s with a very calm and precise way of asking questions that I appreciated enormously, helped me understand something I had been circling around for years without landing on. She helped me see that I had spent my whole life proving that I was real family, by being useful, by providing, by never asking for more than I gave, by making myself indispensable in the hope that indispensability would eventually be read as belonging. And what Gary had done, with those 3 words at the dinner table, was strip away the illusion that any amount of usefulness would ever be enough to earn the thing I had been trying to earn, because belonging cannot be earned. It either exists or it does not. My relationship with my mother continued to heal, slowly and imperfectly, in the way that real healing always does. She never fully acknowledged what she had not said at the dinner table that Tuesday night. Not directly, not in words, but she showed it in other ways. She showed it in the way she started calling me first when she had news, rather than telling Gary and then telling me. She showed it in the way she started using my name, the way it sounded before Gary came along. Diane, not D, which was what Gary called me, and which I had always disliked. She showed it in the way she showed up at my house on my birthday with a casserole dish and a card that said, in her own handwriting, not the inside of a printed card but her own words in her looping cursive, that she was proud of the woman I had become, and that she was sorry for the ways she had let me feel otherwise. I kept that card. It is in the drawer of my nightstand. I still read it sometimes. I want to tell you about the moment I finally felt like the house on Birchwood Drive was truly mine, because I think you deserve a moment in this story that is not about loss or confrontation or the slow accumulation of hurt. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in October, 14 months after I changed the locks. I had my two closest friends over, women I had known since college, and we cooked together in my kitchen and ate at my table and talked for 6 hours about everything and nothing, and at some point in the middle of the evening, with the kitchen smelling of something good and the October light going golden through the window and my friends' laughter filling the rooms, I looked around at my own house and I felt it. I felt it, the way you feel a thing you have been waiting for without quite knowing you were waiting. This was mine, all of it. Not because of the deed or the mortgage or the legal definition of property ownership, but because I was finally, fully, unapologetically in it, and nobody was about to rearrange it. 125, 140. Philosophical reflection and callback. I think about family a lot now, in a different way than I used to. I used to think of family as a fixed thing, a set of people you were assigned to by biology, or by a marriage certificate, people you owed things to by virtue of the assignment. I thought loyalty meant staying, meant keeping quiet, meant absorbing whatever was directed at you because the alternative was breaking something that could not be fixed. I have come to understand, slowly and at some cost, that this is not loyalty. This is just fear, dressed up in the language of love. Real family, I think now, is something that has to be demonstrated repeatedly and in both directions. It is not enough to share a last name, or a history, or a holiday table. It has to be shown in the small moments, in who defends you when you are not in the room, in who holds your name carefully rather than dropping it carelessly, in who shows up for you when it is inconvenient and not just when it is easy. Gary used the word family like it was a membership he could claim without earning, like the fact that he had married my mother gave him permanent residency in a place he had done nothing to build. And when I stopped letting him claim it, he tried to redefine me out of it, as though I were the intruder in a story I had been telling long before he arrived. I think about the girl on Clover Street sometimes, the girl who stood at the window and watched her father's truck leave the driveway and decided right then, in the way children decide things, that she was going to build something so solid that nobody could take it from her. I think about how she grew up and worked and saved and bought a house with a green front door because she had always loved the green door, even when everything inside the house it belonged to was complicated. I think about how she opened that door, fully and genuinely, to the people she loved, and how some of those people walked through it and made themselves at home in a way that left very little room for her. I think about how she got the door back, and I think about how she painted the kitchen the color she had always wanted and planted a rose bush along the fence, and learned, at 34, what it felt like to live inside her own life without apology. I want to ask you something before I go, and I want you to think about it honestly, not in the comment section, but in the quiet of wherever you are right now. Have you ever made yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what you should be? Have you ever confused keeping the peace with keeping yourself? Have you ever sat at a table and absorbed something you should have stood up and named, because you were afraid that naming it would cost you something you could not afford to lose? And if you have, I want to ask you a second question, which is this: what are you still carrying that was never yours to carry in the first place? Because here is what I know now, and I want you to hear it clearly. The door of your life, the actual door, the one with your name on the deed and your hands on the key, that door is yours to open and yours to close. And nobody, Not someone who married into your family, not someone who called you by a nickname you never chose, not someone who stood on your porch and told you who was and was not real. Nobody gets to decide who comes through that door, except you. That is not cruelty. That is not overreaction. That is the most basic and fundamental thing a person can do, to say, "This is mine, and I am choosing who gets to be inside it." 140-155. Extended epilogue. A year and a half after I changed the locks on Birchwood Drive, something happened that I had not anticipated, and that I feel I owe you in the spirit of complete honesty, because I think incomplete endings are their own kind of dishonesty. Gary and my mother separated, not immediately after everything that happened with me, not for reasons directly connected to it, but in the way that things which have been unstable for a long time eventually stop holding. My mother called me on a Thursday evening and told me that she and Gary had decided to part ways, and that she was okay, that it had been coming for a while, and that she was more relieved than she expected to be. She said she had been thinking a lot about things, about the choices she had made, about the moments she could not take back, and that she wanted to do something she had not done nearly enough of, which was to put me first for once. I did not say I told you so, because that would have been cheap, and also untrue to what I was feeling, which was not triumph but something much quieter and more complicated. I felt sad for her, in the way you feel sad when someone arrives at a truth you arrived at much earlier, because there is no joy in being right about something that cost everyone involved so much. I told her I was glad she was okay. I told her I was there, and I meant it in a new way, a way that was no longer obligated or performed, but chosen, freely and clearly, because I had learned by then the difference between those two things. Marcus called me about 2 months after my mother told me the news. I was genuinely surprised to hear from him. He had grown quieter over the preceding year, and I had wondered sometimes about the version of events he had been given and what he had done with them. He was calling, he said, to apologize, and not on behalf of his father, on his own behalf, for the ways he had been held up in contrast to me without ever pushing back against it, for the ring that had gone to his girlfriend, for the years of being treated as the favored one in a house where the actual owner was being edged out, and for not saying anything about any of it while it was happening. I did not expect an apology from Marcus, and I did not know what to do with it at first, so I just let him give it, and I thanked him for it, and I told him I did not blame him for his father's choices, even if some of those choices had affected me. We have spoken a few times since. It is not a close relationship and probably never will be, but it is an honest one, which I have come to value more than closeness. Gary, as far as I know, moved back to Kentucky to be closer to family, which is the word he has always used most freely. I have not spoken to him since the day I ended that phone call and blocked his number, and I do not expect that will change. I do not have anger toward him anymore, not because he did not earn it, but because anger is heavy, and I have chosen to put it down. What I have instead is clarity, a very clean and specific clarity about who I am, what I built, and what I will and will not allow inside the things I build. That clarity cost me a lot. It cost me 2 years of quiet accumulation of hurt before I finally acted. It cost me a season of strained silence with my mother. It cost me, in some ways, the version of family I had hoped we would all be. But it gave me something I did not know I was missing, which was the full and undivided experience of my own life. The house on Birchwood Drive still has the green front door. The rosebush along the back fence bloomed for the first time this past spring. Enormous pink blooms that I photographed and sent to my mother, who sent back a string of heart emojis and told me she had always known I had a green thumb. And I laughed, because she had never said that before, and it felt like a small new thing beginning. Which is what healing always feels like when it is actually happening. Not like a resolution, but like a beginning. And there is one more thing I want to tell you. A few months ago, I was going through the drawer of my nightstand to look for my mother's birthday card, the one she wrote in her own looping cursive, and I found something underneath it that I had completely forgotten about. It was a small envelope that Aunt Carol's attorney had mailed to me around the time of the estate, separate from the main communication about the will, and that I had apparently tucked away without opening during a week when I had too much on my mind to handle one more piece of paperwork. I opened it. Inside was a short note in Aunt Carol's handwriting, dry and precise in the way she always was. and taped to the bottom of the note was a small gold band with a dark green stone. She had sent it separately, directly to me, before the will was even read, because she had wanted to make sure it got to the right person. My grandmother's ring had been with me the whole time. I had just not known where to look. 1:55, 2 o'clock and decretes. And outro. I have told you everything I know how to tell you about Birchwood Drive, and the people who came through its door, and the Tuesday night that changed the architecture of my life. I have tried to tell it honestly, which means I have tried not to make myself a saint, and not to make Gary a monster, because the truth of these situations is almost never that clean. The truth is usually messier and sadder and more human than the clean version, and I think you deserve the human version because I suspect many of you have lived something like it. Maybe not the same details, maybe not the same words said across a dinner table, but the feeling of it, the slow realization that someone in your life has been treating your generosity as permission, and the even slower realization of what you are going to have to do about it. So I want to ask you, and I mean this genuinely, not as a formality but as an actual question that I would love to read your thoughts on. What would you have done? If you had been sitting at that table on that Tuesday evening, if those 3 words had been aimed at you, in the house you had worked 10 years to own, what would you have done? Would you have locked the door? Would you have kept the peace? Would you have done something I have not even considered? Tell me in the comments, because I read them, and because I think these conversations, the real ones, the ones that happen between people who have actually lived hard things, are the most valuable ones there are. And if this story reached something in you today, something quiet and specific that you recognized without expecting to, please share it with someone who might need to hear it too. There are a lot of people out there carrying things in silence that this kind of story can help them name. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next, because the next story I am going to tell you is about what happened when my sister tried to remove my name from our late mother's property without telling me, and I promise you, it starts in a place you would never expect. Until then, take care of the things you have built. Take care of the people who actually show up for you, and if someone ever stands in your house and tells you that you are not real family, I hope you remember exactly what to do with that key. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.